But Dr. Yu, if I may have the liberty of just asking the very first question before handing over to Weng Hin, would be that as a professional practicing in many different worlds, what has been maybe a useful way of entering this discussion with a community that often doesn't think of conservation as part of their universe? It's just a living thing. Perhaps you could share on that.
Well, it's actually a very loaded question. I think one of the things is that is to start every project with a clear aims of what do you want to do. It's always very useful to spend some time with the owners and different consultants about all different parties to come up with a common understanding and to thresh out the differences. So it's perhaps just like to break the ice, have a group of people sitting together and go around the table and ask, so what does this restoration project mean to you? And we list them down and to find out what are the differences. And when we can articulate and we can speak of it very transparently on the table, we can then agree to disagree. I think to agree to disagree is a very important aspect in all restoration projects, including the respect for the craft person, the craftsman that is involved in the project. And in most of the time in the various projects I've seen earlier, the craftsman may have very different ideas about restoration than the consultant and also of the owners. So there are actually a kind of very healthy respect for the crafts, a very healthy respect for opinions of different people, and as I mentioned earlier, to agree to disagree.
Thanks. Hello. Thanks, Kang Shua. For me, any questions from the floor?
Institute of Arts and Immigration. Can you please define, Doctor, that what do you mean by merit making? Because it could mean different things to people.
Merit making is a concept that is very imbued in Southeast Asia and Asia context, especially Buddhism. The idea that in terms of religious building, temples, shrines, that you donate money to enlarge the temple, to beautify the temple, and in fact, throughout history, it's because of such act of merit making that we see beautiful monuments of today. So obviously the concept of restoration that we inherit from the West runs contrary to the idea of merit making. And hence I was just promoting the idea of actually conservation as merit making as an idea to resolve the antagonistic problem that we have today.
Does that answer your question?
As I said, it could be defined by different people in different ways. One of it, merit making, is perhaps also social. That means the temple space could be used by the community. That could be a form of merit as well. Then the architecture could be different. That how well they can preserve the building.
Definitely, I agree fully with you. For me, my take on merit making as conservation, I fully subscribe to that view, especially working on commercial projects. Many times we are asked by developers, why am I keeping this old building and spending the money on it? So I tell them, you're making merit for yourself. Yeah. Jokes aside, I think I also have the same question, I mean, if you don't mind, Kang Shua. When you talk about the case of Tan Si Chong Su, quite rightly so, you said that the conflict occurred because the temple owners went ahead to do renovations on the building without getting approval from the enforcement agency, which is Preservation of Monuments Board. In my mind, I think I don't have a quarrel with the concept of merit making per se, but I think what needs to be distinguished, maybe in this case, is the idea that once you gazette a national monument, there is a larger dimension to the building. It does not necessarily mean it belongs to certain groups or certain communities, but there is a shared space. And I guess the role of the agencies is to ensure that this shared space is not encroached upon or just privilege a single group and allow these transgressions to occur. Yeah, that's my take. Okay, any, oh, there's a question from Mr. Repellin. What are your views on the current state of the repaired stained glass windows of the Chimes Chapel? Have you seen?
First of all, I apologize because I have been too long. No, I haven't seen it. So I remember the last time, 2 years ago, there was, I don't know if they have a picture, but we could see some gray paint on the lead. I think it's just a question of using different mastic to fill the gap between the glass and the thing. They cemented? Okay, they cemented. It is possible to repair, no problem. Now you have, can you imagine at Chimes, you had at that time the best stained glass maker in the world. His name was Didier. He was very famous. He was not only a stained glass maker, but he was a very great painter. So the design, all the fabrics, and is really a masterpiece for the stained glass windows.
Thank you. Any questions? Please, if you don't mind, could you step forward to the mic?
Hello, my name is Georgia. I'm with the National Heritage Board. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the considerations with authenticity. So if a building has had multiple uses over time and has had multiple restorations over various centuries, what layer of history do you return to? How do you decide which period to return to and which is the most valuable one to restore or conserve?
It's always, I would say, the debate. What do you keep? What do you restore? What do you remove? I would say the first thing is really to fully understand the piece. It could be any type. It could be a building, a statue, and everything. It's the same principle. And then, really of course, you have to make a judgment. I would say, if it's just an addition, with a full understanding what it used to be and so on, even if it's a later addition, it doesn't matter. If it's well, I would say, if it's in harmony with the conception, the original conception, if it's just what we call a bricolage, which means an odd job of a Sunday afternoon, then it's no interest at all. Sometimes it's difficult to judge, but more of the time it's not so difficult. Mainly because if you start from to be demanding with the know-how, then you know where is the limit.
Any further questions, or Kang Shua, do you have any comments to that question? Oh, wow, there's quite a lot.
It's a great system. I think when it's anonymous, you're all there to ask more questions.
It's very suitable for Singapore audience. Can we, okay, are these questions addressed to both speakers? Or, okay, there are two questions. Okay, perhaps both speakers could comment. I'll ask Mr. Repellin to comment first on the second question. What are your views on Singapore conservation plans? Do you think Singapore has been able to conserve, restore the buildings in an efficient way? It must be efficient.
I should do a school of diplomacy. If not, I won't finish the symposium. What is your view on conservation plan? You know, what I would say I'm very pleased that Mrs. Pamela Lee is here, and URA and all the chief executive and were there. When I arrived here in '87, I think close to 100 shop houses were demolished per day. So it was very scaring when you see, and how to change the mind. It was difficult. I just say one thing very simple. What is a city? It's a book of architecture. If you remove the first chapter, the second and the third won't be so interesting. But it's not an ordinary book, it's a novel. You're always waiting for the next chapter. That was a basic thought at that time. And what I admire a lot, that in '87 a lot were demolishing. In '89, it was the beginning of the preservation department. And congratulations for your efficiency. Because in France, it would have taken 20 years to change the mind. So I always say that Mrs. Lee should be the French Minister of Culture, and to help us. So in terms of efficiency, is absolutely certain. Then, you know, we have to be careful not to copy something, because with heritage is so intimate, is always a case by case. So it cannot be duplicated. The example from another country cannot be duplicated. It's really, you can just get the background of how to analyze and so on. But the decision is to be made locally, because it depends of the policy, it depends of the politics, it depends of the social environment and the climate, also environment. The only thing I could say when I arrived, I was very impressed how clever and how intelligent your whole architecture used to be. With the good materials, not so much maintenance. It was a maintenance only from the owner. There was no specific thing. And it very well adapted to the climate. And I would say today, when around the world, everyone is talking about climate, your heritage is the most modern one.
Thank you. Well, there's a question, a specific question addressed for Dr. Yeo. Let's wait for it to surface. Yes, this one. Dr. Yeo, is it right to frame the debate between positivism and merit-making as an Eastern-Western binary, as Catholic tradition also has elements of merit-making? Your views?
Hello. Yes, I do acknowledge that the Catholic tradition do have a system of merit making. However, where we're discussing about today, Singapore and the region, the Catholics in Singapore and in the region don't really have a serious problem when compared to the other Asians when it comes to merit making. Perhaps it's got to do with the kind of educational background and the kind of upbringing that they are imbued with this kind of Western ideas of conservation. It's the Asians that actually has a serious problem. I wouldn't say, or maybe I will rephrase the term problem. It's kind of a challenge, a different approach towards restoration. And perhaps it's the reason why I try to frame it and to recast what exactly is merit making, and to allow the Asians to understand that conservation is in fact an act of merit making. So that is the kind of framework which I was trying to argue.
Let's look at other questions. Let's look at the one with the heritage ones of the archaeologists and the urban conservationists, or keeping in mind the commercial elements of heritage conservation. That's question number 2. Mr. Repellin?
How do you, while keeping in mind the measurement? I have to correct. It's not a battle and a fight with the archaeologists, between architects and archaeologists. It's just a different view, I would say. I've been working for many years and decades with archaeologists, and it's very interesting and very exciting because they give you other knowledge. You know, it's they give you very precious knowledge, not only knowledge, but understanding. What he used to be, how he used to be, and so on. So today, in every building, historical monuments in France, I'm always working with an archaeologist, always. Not only with the underground, not only the foundations, but also for the elevations, because they can realize a lot of things. It is sure a conservation, a rehabilitation project is always a long discussion because you have many parameters. You have the parameter of history, of archaeology, of I would say the usage, of the previous usage and the new one, and also the environment, the social environment, and so on. So where is the problem is to create a hierarchy between the different elements. What is important, what is not important, and in the meantime, to try to, you know, not to sterilize these historic buildings. I always say that instead of being or doing, I don't know, Singapore conservation plan, heritage conservation plan, it's better to do a heritage development plan, which is interesting. We should be more developers of heritage than conservators of heritage. That's the main thing. And in this case, you see the things differently, and you have together, you know, you are almost like a chief orchestra. You have all the different team and instruments, and you have to play with them to keep the harmony of the total. It's mainly to keep the general view and the forces of this building and the original conception is mainly this. But it's not so difficult. I would say for me it's even much more interesting and stimulating.
Actually, thank you, Mr. Repellin. I think there is also a second part of the question which says, how do we balance the heritage needs with the commercial requirements of heritage projects, especially adaptive reuse projects? Perhaps you have something to add to that?
It depends of which type of buildings, but I mean, some of the buildings I showed you has always been made to be commercial. So it's not so difficult. The difficulties, which I can guess, is mainly with the temples, with the religious building, because it was not really made to be commercial and so on. But there is always one way. But sure, we could say you can do whatever you want, technically I say, whatever you want in every building. Sure, but then you just have to apply the good sense. And the good sense tell you, no, it's not nice to... I remember there was a cartoon in France about heritage. Why can we make a swimming pool within a church? And the answer say, yeah, technically it's possible, but who will feel comfortable to be in a swimming suit in the middle between arcades and columns and so on? That's it. And then you got the answer.
Thank you. I think the next question is more or less similar. How to decide whether to restore? Yeah, I think it's something. Okay, Salma. Yeah.
Actually, my question is for Dr. Yeo. I think you were addressing the motivation, and are you saying that the
It's actually both. I think when we started out the restoration, the motivation is always very important. You get the motivation right, the rest are easy to resolve. So the aims and motivation of projects, the objective of a project is always the key in setting the tone, I say, of the project. Once the objective is actually set, then the methods of doing restoration is the key now. So the methods, for example, the temples, well, currently there are still traditions of restoring temples in China, in the region, in Southeast Asia. And as much as, in my own opinion, we should respect the different tradition of restoring. And it's only when cases whereby the skill set can never surpass the skill set of the past, right? In those particular areas, then perhaps we can use modern science to help us restore and conserve those components. For example, say a piece of fresco painting that's beautifully executed 100 years ago, and craftsmen of today can never surpass that kind of skill set. And we do have a very good museum conservators who can conserve fresco, and thereby we could adopt a modern science in helping us to conserve. Of course, if you ask any skilled craftsman what they will do, they will say, well, the only way is to remove the existing fresco, right, and to do from scratch, right? So there's always a balance between what do you want to conserve, do you want to really respect the traditional craft, if the craft is no longer able to execute the level of work that's required.
Thank you, Kang Shua. We still have a couple of minutes left. Any last question from the floor? Or yes.
I think there is a bit of Kang Shua. I would say, just to comment, that a lot of people, although the two temples that you cited, I think that in Singapore, especially when both have the same gazetted status, a lot of people actually don't realize that, you know, when you say a temple, I was just asking my friend, one is a shi, which is more of a monastic, and it serves a community thing, which is the second case, the Hongshan Shi, and then the first, which is the Tan Si Chong Su, which is owned by my relatives. And so I would say that, yes, when the first one, with the family, when I speak to them, they do see it, that there is a bit of a confusion between the ownership of the state, which it is now because of the gazetting, and the members of my family, which see it as a private shrine for the past 150 to 200 years since we have been on this island. So yes, I think that if you look at the Chinese word, it is a very strict thing, and I think that the challenge is also for the members of the family to realize that it is no longer a private sanctuary, you know, a mausoleum where you can go and just honor your ancestors exclusively. That is something which you must open to all members of the Tans on this island, those that came earlier and those that came later. So yes, I think it's very good that you mention about merit, because merit for the Buddhist, it would apply very well. But for the Taoist and for ancestor worship, I think it's quite different. You know, it's like if you go to the Temple of Heaven and you tell them merit, and the Qing will tell you to F off. I mean, you know, in the past, so.
Well, I totally agree with you, but then I also agree with our moderator that once a building is gazetted, there is an obligation to the public. There's a notion of public good, and the state has in its responsibility to safeguard the public good. And it's always this conflict between what is personal and what is public, and the different ideas and ideology of conservation that gets into a kind of huge debate and differences. So the differences lies within that. And which is why I always advocate that before anything is being done, it's good to have a very common, transparent platform to discuss the different notions of restoration to each and every different parties, including the authorities.
Last question is addressed to Mr. Repellin. What is your view on preserving the living heritage and the people? Is this as important as preserving the building?
Of course. Again, I would say it depends how do you look at the buildings. As I already told you, for me, always look at behind the building. And I would say what I would call the fourth dimension of heritage is the human heritage. It's not only in 3 dimensions, but there is a fourth one. And that gives a kind of everlasting feeling with this type of buildings. You know, the main criteria for an historical monument is never obsolete. It's never obsolete. So it's always on fashion and interesting for one part of the thing. So that means with heritage is really, is not only a lesson of humility. We have to have an ambitious humility, which is more important, which means it's really to adapt to the society and to continue as they used to do before. So I would make, sure, it's like, you know, when I'm leading a work site, I always say, I'm never afraid about the technical problem. I'm always afraid a human problem. That's the same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Repellin. And with that, I believe it's time for a coffee break. You can take a rest and